I'm Ruth Mandel, director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and what a great pleasure to welcome you to the public lecture by this year's Clifford Case Professor of Public Affairs. The Eagleton Institute is honored to have brought esteemed public leaders to Rutgers under the banner of the Case Professorship since the first one, and that was back in 1983. And I want to thank President Robert Barchi for the opportunity to continue that wonderful tradition. In 1980, the Rutgers Board of Governors voted to establish the Clifford P. Case Professorship of Public Affairs to recognize Senator Case's 34 years representing the state of New Jersey in the United States Congress. The professorship honors his memory, and the quote is, "The memory of Senator Case, who consistently put principles above politics and gained broad respect for his profound sense of integrity throughout his long career." The Case program has been prestigious from the beginning and has brought the most prominent and respected public servants to Rutgers. This year's Case Professor is just such a prominent and respected public servant. Our audience tonight includes 3 generations of Case family members, including Senator Case's daughter, Ann Case Holt, and her husband, John, who are loyal and generous supporters of Rutgers. And I don't know where you're sitting now, Ann and John, but I want to oh, there you are, right in front of me. I want to thank you on behalf of the university community. Tonight, I'm privileged to welcome a Case professor whom I've known and admired for a very long time. I first met her in the 1980s. Both of us were a tad younger then. In 1987, then Representative Snowe was one of just 25 women in Congress, 2 in the Senate, 23 in the House. As an FYI, today there are 98 women in the Congress, 20 in the Senate. We still have a way to go, right? 78 in the House today. She and 5 of her female congressional colleagues composed a bipartisan panel at the Forum for Women State Legislators, one of a series of national conferences convened by Eagleton's Center for American Women and Politics. That year, we brought together 450 women lawmakers, and they talked across party lines about a range of policy issues in an atmosphere of competitive but collegial bipartisanship. Those were the days. During her career on Capitol Hill, Congresswoman and then Senator Snowe garnered nationwide recognition as a leading Washington policymaker, frequently cited for her consensus-building leadership. In 2006, Time magazine named her one of the top 10 United States senators, calling her the caretaker and observing, quote, "Because of her centrist views and eagerness to get beyond partisan point scoring, Maine Republican Olympia Snowe is in the center of every policy debate in Washington. But while Snowe is a major player on national issues, she is also known as one of the most effective advocates for her constituents back home in Maine. The only woman ever to have served in both houses of her state legislature and both houses of Congress, Olympia Snowe left office stymied by the seeming inability of Congress to find sensible approaches for solving the nation's pressing problems. In the book that she's written recently called Fighting for Common Ground, How We Can Fix the Stalemate in Congress, was published earlier this year, she insists that, quote, "It doesn't have to be this way." An optimist who finds something good in everyone she mentions. She knows what needs fixing, and she is dedicated to the idea of, quote, making the process of governing work for the common good. Today, as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and co-chair of its Commission on Political Reform, Olympia Snowe uses her strong voice to call for an end to partisan gridlock. She has also established Olympia's List, which recognizes and supports elected officials and candidates who demonstrate their commitment to solving our nation's problems, and she's established a leadership institute to encourage young women to participate in public service. Senator Snowe's book charts a remarkable life and career. I won't go into the details of her remarkable life, but it is quite stunning to read about her early years. The book is on sale here this evening, and Senator Snowe will be happy to sign autographs after her talk. Now, on the very day when headlines from Washington make her message more urgent, more and more urgent, it's my honor and personal privilege to present this year's Clifford Case Professor, Senator Olympia Snowe.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ruth, for that beautiful introduction. She's just the best, isn't she? Then phenomenal work. I'm going to get into that in a moment, but I truly appreciate those beautiful words. And it's wonderful to be here tonight having this whole lecture sponsored by the Eagleton Institute as well. And thank you all for that very warm welcome. It's great to see such a wonderful crowd here this evening. And in return, I'm going to follow the advice that was given to me by a very wise person who said, Olympia, a great speech is one with a good beginning and a good ending, which are kept very close together. So I'm going to try to heed that. I'm sure you'll appreciate that, too. But I will try to make my remarks as short as possible, because I don't want to be in the position of a certain minister who is giving a very long sermon. And towards the conclusion, he looked up at the congregation. He said, you know, I don't mind you're looking at your watches to see what time it is, but he said it is a bit much when you're tapping them to see if they're still working. So in any event, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible given the subject matter, and I know that all of you are concerned about. I do want to express my appreciation and gratitude to President Barchi and his wife Frances for the wonderful hospitality, exceptional hospitality extended to me and all the Rutgers community here today. It's been a wonderful visit, and I have more tomorrow with students and faculty who are extraordinary. But it truly is a pleasure to be here at this remarkable university of 247 years, providing top-flight teaching, educational excellence, and critical research, which is an incalculable benefit, not only to the state of New Jersey and to our country, but indeed the world. So it is an honor to be here tonight. And I do want to thank Ruth Mandel for not only sponsoring this event, but also being a transformational figure on the national landscape for advancing women and the participation and empowering women in the political system and in the public sector. I got to know Ruth, as she said, just about 30 years ago, and she invited me to a women's forum with the women state legislators out in California because at the time trying to elevate the number of women participating in the political process. And at the time, I was co-chairing the Congressional Caucus on Women's Issues as a Republican, along with Democratic Congresswoman Pat Schroeder from Colorado. And at the time, it was unusual, to have that kind of compatibility, but really not so unusual given today's events. I mean, we work together, irrespective of differences on any other issues. We work together on women, family, and children, because it was so important to change the laws that were working against women, and also to mitigate some of the issues with respect to child care, pension reform, and tax laws, family and medical leave, which was really spearheaded by former Congresswoman Marge Rocklmer from here in New Jersey. It took 7 long years to get family and medical leave, but you know, we're very persistent, and Marge certainly was, and we got it done. But Ruth has, I think, certainly been a woman ahead of her time. And all of us as women who have been in the public sector and in the political system are truly indebted to her for her efforts and continuing to plow new ground, and for women to participate in why they don't, what we have to do, provide the training and the education and the guidance in order for more women to be represented in our governing institutions at all levels of government. And the Eagleton Institute that she's now spearheading has, I think, also transformational, because it's examining the current contemporary political system and how it works and how it doesn't work, how we can make it better, which is as relevant today as it ever has been, given what we've witnessed, regrettably, unfolding in Washington. And I think that New Jersey is clearly a harbinger of things to come, because I think you're a bellwether state in these off-year elections, and certainly that was the case in this recent election with the re-election of Governor Christie with resounding margins from Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, because people are clamoring all over this country, I can tell you. And I think it was reinforced by the vote here in New Jersey, is they're looking for leadership, where leaders are willing to put pragmatism and principles above politics. And that's really what it has to be all about. I've always believed the essence of public service is solving problems, and that is the responsibility of an elected official. And obviously, it's gone awry in Washington. So that is what has to change. And you know, you were very fortunate to have leadership that understands the practicality, you know, of solving problems and working it out across the political aisle. And that's why I am so grateful to be here tonight as a Clifford Case Professor of Public Affairs. And I'm truly honored to have here with us tonight Senator Case's daughter, Ann, and her husband, John, and 3 generations, as Ruth mentioned, of the Holt family who are represented. Is a singular privilege to be recognized in the name of Senator Case. I mean, he was obviously a legendary senator, and for 34 exemplary years in serving in both the House and the Senate as an independent voice and a legislative force who was willing to embrace bipartisanship. And his legacy, I think, is more relevant today than ever before. You know, in fact, the New York Times wrote in their obituary of him that he received much of his support from admiring Democrats because of his uncompromising conscience. And that's really what public service is all about. It's about doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And that's a tradition of independence in pursuit of policy over politics. It's certainly been the hallmark of my state of Maine, and certainly is true here in New Jersey. And I believe that that heritage of in pursuit of solutions to problems over party labels was not only reflected in this election, but also in previous elections when we had the benefit tonight at dinner to have 3 former governors of New Jersey with us, Governor Kane, Governor Florio, and Governor Whitman, all of whom embody the ideals, you know, of practical problem solving and result-oriented leadership, because ultimately that is what public service should represent, and they were certainly practitioners of that approach. And I was just honored to be with them tonight and to be able to visit with them. I knew them both, knew Tom and Christy from our days in working within the Republican Party as well. My husband was a governor, and his administration crossed over when Tom Kane was governor and when Christie was governor. And Jim Florio, I happened to serve with in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we were both commenting tonight how much had changed, where, you don't have the kind of collaboration that existed at a time when we were there in the House of Representatives, when you could work across the aisle in spite of the fierce fights and differences in philosophy and politics and beliefs. At the end of the day, you knew that the ultimate goal was to solve the problems facing this country. That's what it was all about. So I think that the results here have embraced a can-do spirit that was exemplified by Senator Case and certainly by all of the previous leaders that I've just mentioned, including your current governor. And I think that the Garden State has certainly produced a bumper crop and harvest of political pragmatism and practicality. So I want to congratulate you for that, and thank you for leading the way as well. I'm also very pleased to be here tonight because I'm in the company of thoughtful, forward-looking, reasonable-minded people. Not that Washington hasn't been brimming with such people these days, but in any event, in case you hadn't noticed. But that's exactly what I want to address tonight, is exactly, what has gone wrong in Washington, what has contributed to the breakdown in the political system, and more importantly, the decision-making, the inability to make decisions in Washington that, unfortunately is impeding their ability to grapple with the major problems of our time. And why, in spite of all of that, as Ruth noted, I'm an optimist, why I believe that we can make government work again, because it's absolutely essential that we do, and we can. As Ruth mentioned, this is actually my first out of 40 years. I'm no longer serving in the legislative branch of government, unbelievably. So it's sort of a surreal experience in many ways, 34 of which I did spend in the House of Representatives in the United States Senate. And as you can imagine, I've had many experiences over time, some good and some not so good. And I'm always reminded of the story that the late Senator Charles Mack Mathias, who was a Republican senator, moderate Republican senator from Maryland, who happened to own a home in Maine, off the coast of Maine on an island called Isle Hoe. And one day, Senator Mathias was taking the ferry from the mainland to the island, and the ferry operator recognized him. He said, "You're Senator Mathias, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." So a conversation began. In the course of the discussion, the ferry operator said to him, "There must be a lot of smart people down in Washington, aren't there?" And Senator Mathias said, "Yes, there are a lot of smart people." And the ferry operator went on to say, "And I bet that there are a lot of people who aren't so smart." And Senator Mathias said, "Well, yes, I'd have to agree with you on that, too." To which the ferry operator quickly replied, "And I bet it's harder and harder to tell the difference." So, well, there are still a few smart people down there, but let me put it this way, that unfortunately the potential of Congress has not been exhibited in recent years. There was a time when I had the good fortune and privilege to witness that potential, to be part of it, and to experience it. But there are fewer and fewer examples of that potential, obviously, as we've seen today. And that's really what contributed to my decision and not to seeking re-election to the United States Senate. Because I recognized, or at least I confronted, the cold, stark reality that the polarization and the partisanship would not diminish in the short term. And normally, under ordinary circumstances, I would enjoy being right. But the perilous inaction and the dynamic of the hyperpartisanship that exists today is really imperiling, the future of this country. And in the past, we could work together, as I said, in working through our problems if we were determined to solve a problem. And again, I experienced firsthand that people across the political aisle who had fierce differences, different philosophies, that's for sure, but could accomplish great things in spite of those differences because they were determined to ultimately to achieve a result for the good of their constituents and for the good of this country. We're not, in my second term, we obviously in 1980, President Reagan had been elected. And it was a very difficult time, as you recall. We were facing the twin events of the hostage-taking crisis in Iran, and at the same time, a plummeting economy with double-digit inflation, interest rates, and prime rates of upwards of 20%. And President Reagan understood, as did his team, that in order to revive the economy, that he would have to build a coalition in the Democratic House of Representatives. And that's exactly what he accomplished. And I was part of that coalition as a moderate Republican, working alongside with moderate and conservative Democrats, and built a strong coalition that engineered a bold economic recovery plan. And they worked hand in glove to make sure that that happened. President George H.W. Bush in 1990 had to engineer and broker a pivotal budget agreement for which he paid a political price. It was in the midst of a very difficult recession and an impasse had occurred on the budget. And yet they ultimately ensconced themselves out at Andrews Air Force Base and achieved an agreement in order to move the process forward and in order to enact a budget and to bring down the deficits and to address some of the economic questions. But ultimately, he did pay that political price. President Clinton, when he came to Congress when he was elected president, 2 years later in the Congress, it became a Republican Congress for the first time in 50 years. And so he staked out positions on issues such as balanced budget, tax cuts, and welfare reform that were traditional Republican issues. But he believed in triangulation between the positions of the Democrats and the positions of the Republicans. In fact, when he was addressing these positions and these planks in his State of the Union address, former President Reagan was quoted as saying, well, that was tantamount to grand larceny, because President Clinton was appropriating all these Republican issues. But he understood that he had to work with Republicans. And as a result, they agreed to 4 years of balanced budgets that produced surpluses for the first time since the 1930s. Then, subsequent to the 2000 election, in 2001, I ultimately co-chaired a centrist coalition along with Democrat John Breaux from Louisiana. And we decided that it was important to build a coalition in the United States Senate to ensure that we could preserve bipartisanship and not derail our legislative agenda, because the times were very tense. In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision on the presidential election, in addition to which we were so narrowly divided in the Senate that a few months later we actually became 50-50 Senate, when Senator Jeffords, who was a Republican, became an independent. And so we invited the majority leader, Senator Lott, and the minority leader, Senator Daschle, to our meeting. We had more than a third of the Senate show up, equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, because we wanted to be sure that we could move ahead in a legislative agenda and preserve the bipartisanship that was necessary and essential to accomplish it. And that's precisely what happened. In fact, President Bush was able to enact the largest tax cut in history, because at that time the tax burden was the highest on the American people since World War II, in addition to his educational reform, in which he partnered at that time with then Senator Ted Kennedy. I mentioned to you all of these examples because they were the means by which you achieve bipartisan legislative results. These partnerships become absolutely crucial if you're going to minimize the political barriers and to maximize the potential of Congress. But today, bipartisan collaboration is as rare as a dinosaur sighting. And, and so that's why I made the difficult decision that I did. Not because I didn't love the Senate or I didn't believe in its potential, but precisely because I do. I decided that I would take the fight outside of the institution because I didn't believe that the change would occur within the institution itself. And so therefore, I decided to harness my experience and my knowledge of the institution and how it used to work, and not only reaffirm the public's frustration that Congress is too partisan, which, of course, almost every American believes that, but what we can do to make a change, because it is absolutely vital that we make a change before we institutionalize and make permanent the kind of culture that has taken hold in the current Congress. It's hard to believe that we would have gone through this recent shutdown, because if you think about all that's occurred over the last few years, every single crisis was artificially designed by the United States Congress. And what really got my attention was in 2011 with respect to the debt ceiling crisis. Frankly, when we began the new Congress, I had great hope and optimism that it was going to be a very productive Congress, because we had just come off a lame duck session that was extremely successful and enacted many major and significant landmark initiatives. But the opposite occurred in 2011, to which point, as you all know, the debt ceiling at that time, which had already been speculated about in the election of 2010, what was going to happen with, members of the Tea Party, who represented in Congress now, would they raise the debt ceiling, would there be a major fight, and so on. But we had two different deadlines, one in March and one in May, and then it was pushed off to August because they had enough revenues to carry us through to that point. All of that time, Congress did not address the question. In fact, it was one of the least productive sessions. Half of that time was spent in non-legislative activities. So we were up against the 11th hour in August, as you well know, which tripped the wire on our AAA credit rating for the first time. We lost it in our entire history. That produced the highest level of policy uncertainty of any event that has occurred over the last 25 years, according to 3 economists. Think about it. Of over the last 25 years, and that would include 3 wars, impeachment, the catastrophic events of September 11th, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and, of course, the financial crisis. But that one event alone sent shockwaves not only around the country, but around the world. And so, as if that wasn't enough, at the end of that last Congress, we were bookended by the fiscal cliff crisis. And again, it was manufactured by the United States Congress, because it included the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, which actually occurred at the end of 2010. But Congress decided we're going to extend them temporarily to beyond the election of 2012 before we would address it, before 2010. It went from 2010 to 2011, and then at the end of the year in 2012. And so it included the automatic cuts that were set to expire, that were part of the debt ceiling agreement after the super committee had failed, which was created as a part of the debt ceiling agreement. If you remember, that 12-member committee that was going to be a substitute for 535 members of Congress, and they were going to be charged with entitlement reform, tax reform, debt ceiling agreement, all within a 90-day period. Well, it was designed to fail, obviously. So from that came the automatic cuts of $1.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Well, they were set to expire. So we ultimately ended up with an agreement in the back rooms, which inevitably results in poor policy, with a 2 o'clock in the morning on New Year's Day vote in the United States Senate, which actually happened to be my last vote of my congressional career. But it was illustrative of a process gone awry. Now, you would have thought that, why would you put people through more emotional and economic travail and upheaval, having gone through the debt ceiling crisis, then put them through this, and then ultimately what transpired and manifested itself with the recent shutdown and the debt ceiling that ultimately put us on the precipice. Tom Friedman last spring wrote a column that sort of mirrored my sentiments and ones that I had expressed to my colleagues during the time in which we were wrestling with all of these questions in the last Congress, and as a member of the Finance Committee had had jurisdiction over many of these issues, and yet there was an inability to take action because the leadership had decided that they were going to take an alternative course, which was to try to cobble agreement behind closed doors. But Tom Friedman said, we wasted 5 years of a timeout from a geopolitical conflict when we could have been focusing exclusively on the economy without the concerns of a global rattling conflict. And he went on to say that there are a set of world actors that are ready to draw red lines. And as you know, we did have that issue with Syria when the Congress was confronted with the question of giving the president the authorization to launch strikes in Syria when they returned from their August recess. The point being is that you can never foresee the unanticipated. And so that you have to take care of the major issues that are in front of you when you have the time and the opportunity. And we wasted, as he said, those 5 years. We betrayed the can-do opportunities that were reflected in those moments when we could have grappled with these major questions. And that is because the status quo embraces the politics over the policy. And we have virtually abandoned the notion of legislating and governing in place of now taking the place of the whole of politics. In other words, that it's all about the gotcha politics. It's all about leveraging one side to the detriment of the other. And it used to be that the first year after a legislative session, that you could at least count on focusing on the issues that mattered to the country. But now it's all about the next election. It's all about the messaging and how we're going to get the other side and frame that vote or that position that you're compelled to take on an issue that really won't materialize into a solution, but more into a soundbite or a 30-second ad. So it really is lurching from one election to the next, always looking to that moment rather than designing the solutions to the problems facing our country. And nowhere is there a greater indication of that than, of course, than in the breakdown of the budgetary process. Frankly, we virtually had no budget process in Congress over the last few years. In fact, the United States of America has had no operating budget for the last 4 years because Congress hasn't passed a budget. Now, I used to serve on the budget committee, and we worked on budgets, very diligently and seriously. It wasn't always easy, but you made it happen. And so think about the fact that the world's largest economy is operating without a budget. And so this is the 4th consecutive year. They did this year, with much fanfare, pass no budget, no pay, which meant that in each chamber, if they didn't pass a budget, they wouldn't receive their pay. But it did not suggest anything about it not becoming law. And passing a budget is required by law by April 15th, which is obviously a familiar date to all of us. But Congress has failed time and again to follow the statute of passing a budget resolution. That frames your priorities. It sets the stage and the framework for all of the other issues that are going to surround the Congress on the key questions, such as on taxes or entitlements or on spending levels, on discretionary spending, and the list goes on. But there is no budget. Therefore, there has been virtually little attention paid on the floor of the United States Senate to appropriation bills. And so for 2 years in a row, the United States Senate hasn't passed one of the 12 appropriation bills. In the House of Representatives this year, they passed 4 out of the 12. The 12 essentially operate the funding of the federal government. Now, when they had the shutdown recently, if they had had any one of these appropriation bills enacted, then that corresponding agency would have been up and running in spite of the shutdown. But the very fact that none became law, then obviously that leverage existed for political mischief, as we experienced with a 16-day shutdown. A 16-day shutdown that ultimately cost $24 billion to the economy. S&P, dropped their projections for economic growth by 1 percentage point in this last quarter from 3 to 2%. And because of all the policy uncertainty of the last 4 years, it has contributed to, the loss of 900,000 jobs. So it exacts a price. And the same is true, with the debt ceiling crisis of 2011. That will cost the taxpayers $20 billion, essentially, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, over the next 10 years. We pay a price. And that price has been paid time and again. Now, we have an agreement to reopen the government and suspend the debt ceiling by convening a House-Senate budget conference, which is exactly what they should have been doing last February and March when they passed the budgets in each of the chambers. They're doing the work now 52 days into the fiscal year in which they already should have passed the budget, because the beginning of the fiscal year is October 1st. Now, at the time before the shutdown occurred, leaders on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, thought it would be a disastrous course to shut down the government or fail to raise the debt ceiling and default on our debt. But Democrats and Republicans in Congress are like two ships passing in the night. One's in the Atlantic and the other's in the Pacific. Two wildly divergent budgets that were enacted in the Republican House and the Democratic Senate. As one Capitol Hill newspaper described it, you can't even compare these versions like apple and oranges, but rather it would be comparing apples and bicycles. Because they were so philosophically light years apart on the keystone issues of, taxes and entitlements and debt reduction, and yes, of course, the Affordable Care Act, in a Congress that's immersed in a harsh political environment. And that's ultimately what really, I think, gave rise to the ultimate shutdown and the debt ceiling, and certainly indicative of the breakdown in the overall legislative process. It's essential for Congress to move beyond the all-or-nothing propositions. And frankly, the leadership should consign to the dustbins of history this whole scorched earth approach. And the question really is whether or not they will. Now, they've reached, an agreement that they have to develop a budget plan by December 13th, and they've extended the operations of government to January 15th and suspended the debt ceiling until February 7th. I believe that not only should they, pass a budget plan by December 13th, but they also should remove the uncertainty that will continue to persist with the deadlines in January and February. They should get it all done at once in this agreement and remove the uncertainty once and for all, because the economy desperately needs it, and certainly, and most importantly, so do the American people. And frankly, they should cancel their recesses. The one thing that's predictable in Congress are the recesses. I can guarantee you that. I mean, and that's true. I mean, there were more out than in at one point this year. I mean, you saw how they, let the sequestration trigger 1 week before a recess. And 1 week before they were triggered, they went on recess and allowed them to trigger, thinking the other side would blink. Well, neither side, blinked, and ultimately we got the automatic cuts. Not to say they shouldn't achieve those savings of 1.3 trillion over the next 10 years, but rather, more importantly, is making a, discerning decision about which programs are, have merit and which programs do not. And unfortunately, this was taking an indiscriminate approach across the board on all programs in the discretionary category. And as a result, they're facing this challenge right now and grappling with this issue in this House-Senate budget conference. If anything, they'll probably come out with some small agreement to replace some of those cuts with alternative savings. And the real question will be whether or not Republicans are prepared to agree to some revenue increases of some kind. The Democrats are insisting that revenues have to be part of the package. The Republicans are insisting on entitlement savings to be part of the package, and the Democrats are saying no. unless the taxes are part of it. And the Republicans are saying, well, I'm not going to agree to any taxes. We already gave it the office with the fiscal cliff agreement, allowing the lower tax rates to expire for upper income that resulted in $600 billion increases in taxes. So the question is whether or not they're going to be able to resolve the impasse on these key questions. Very doubtful that they will be able to reach an agreement on the larger questions. And frankly, it isn't, they haven't got the time in which to grapple with these questions. And they haven't given it the time in the past, to address these very complex and intricate questions on keystone issues, such as these entitlement programs. And so, it remains to be seen, but it's the public's obligation, too, is to weigh in and to make sure and to demand and insist that they reach an agreement by December 13th, and to include these other deadlines as well, and to resolve those questions once and for all, so that next year they can focus on other consequential matters, such as entitlement reform or immigration reform or on tax reform. But nevertheless, and give it the time that these issues deserve. In the meantime, I think it is clear that we have to work as Americans to ensure that this does not become a permanent political culture of dysfunction in Washington. Congress has to pave the way towards results, and we have to insist on it. If you think about the abrogation of leadership that has brought us to this tipping point, given where we are economically, we have the lowest number of employed Americans in 35 years. The income inequality is the highest since the 1920s. And the rate of job growth on a monthly basis isn't sufficient to bring down the unemployment rate. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the unemployment rate has been dropping in the recent months because many workers have become discouraged. So we have, longer-term unemployment for many millions of Americans. And that is, I think, underscoring some of the challenges and structural problems that we're facing with our economy because of many of the issues that have been neglected by Congress over the last few years. I mean, basically, it's been governance by neglect and default, and running our country by delay and financial and legislative brinkmanship, and it's no way to govern a great nation. There's, other issues that are going to be critically important as we move forward, but most notably is addressing the long-term debt question. And that's why entitlement reform becomes central to this question, because 77 million Americans will retire over the next 20 years. That's a rate of 10,000 Americans a day. And what do those demographics portend, for, Medicare and or Social Security? As one Bloomberg article noted, the failure of Congress to address, our nation's debt and deficits has undermined our economic growth, it's undermined our competitiveness, and the evidence is no longer debatable. What's no longer debatable as well is that we have to stem the corrosive impact of Congress's inertia and inaction on these critical questions that really is putting in jeopardy the future prosperity of this country. Because ultimately it comes down to that question of what we are going to do to address these structural issues in the short period of time in which we have in order to rectify the problems. The fewer years you have, the more punitive the result, because you can't stretch over these changes and remedies over a longer period of time. Usually you'd like to phase them in, but it's very difficult given the window, because the Congressional Budget Office has projected that although the deficit is declining as it is today, it's only a temporary event, that it is scheduled to increase starting in 2016. The trajectory starts to rise because of the demographics and the pressures that will be imposed on these entitlement programs. Debt today stands at 73% of the gross domestic product. Just to make a comparison, at the end of 2007, it was 36% of the gross domestic product, and it's scheduled to rise without any changes in law to 77%. And 40% of our debt is borrowed. And you know, the Federal Reserve has been playing a critical role in monetary policy. Unprecedented monetary action has been taken by the Fed in absence of fiscal policy, the failure of the Congress to enact fiscal policy. Now, Chairman Bernanke has gone before Congress many times and said, please, you know, give me a fiscal plan. And that hasn't happened. So there's no certainty. And you pay a price for that uncertainty. Bill Gaston wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago and underscored this very point by saying that if we had had the policy uncertainty of 2006, we would have had 2 million more jobs in America today than we do. We have not been able to replace the jobs we lost during the course of this recession. We're probably 2 million fewer as a result because we have not kept pace with the kind of recovery that we should have. And it's ultimately resulted in the worst post-recession recovery in the history of our country. We should have been far beyond where we are today had Congress done its job years ago. It's about that wasted time out that Tom Friedman was referring to. People ask me everywhere I go, you know, what has contributed to this political breakdown in Congress? And why has it become so challenging to achieve, you know, bipartisan solutions? And there are a number of reasons that, you know, contribute to the problem. But it's clear that, you know, the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer. And several statistics, I think, illustrate the point. Today in the United States Senate, for example, there are 21 senators who represent one party, but their states have voted for the presidential candidate of the opposing party. So that suggests that 79% of the United States Senate really does not have an incentive to work across the political aisle for fear of risking a primary challenge. So everything is tailored towards the primary base. Another way to look at it was based on the National Journal's evaluation of voting trends that they have conducted since 1982. And back in 1982, they determined that there were 58 senators who fell between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. Today, for the third year in a row and the fourth time ever, the number of senators who fall into that category is literally 0. In the House of Representatives, there were 344 members who crossed the aisle on a bipartisan basis and routinely would work with the other side. So that there were, you know, 344 members who, you know, might have been more conservative than Republicans at one point on an issue, and Republicans who were more liberal than Democrats on some key questions. Today, the number in the House of Representatives that fill that category of a middle ground is essentially 13. So you think of, you know, all of the past events, and what's occurred is ultimately represented in the solidification, you know, and the polarization on both sides to the point that there's virtually no political incentive of working across the political aisle. So it's no wonder then that based on 3 economists' study, three political scientists' study rather, that the United States Congress is the most polarized of any time since Reconstruction in 1879. I mean, think about the fact that Congress is more polarized than at any other moment in 134 years. Now, oftentimes, when there's a discussion about polarization in the United States Senate, people would say, well, you know, there were worse occasions in our history. In the early 1800s, there were duels and canings and, you know, major disagreements and brawls and shootings. And I said, well, is that the standard by which we want to measure the United States Senate in the 21st century? I would hope that we would have advanced and, you know, matured politically in some fashion. mean, I was surrounded by all this history in the United States Capitol in our respective chambers, and yet we're not inspired by it. In fact, in early December, to sort of encourage collegiality and collaboration, because there was the anticipation that we're going to be facing, the fiscal cliff crisis, the majority-minority leader in the Senate decided to air the movie Lincoln, which was a phenomenal movie. And so they had a screening of the movie in the National Visitor Center in their auditorium. And I thought to myself, well, what does that say that we're looking to Hollywood for a dose of reality? I mean, we're sort of really in trouble. But, here we are, and that, unfortunately didn't inspire much collegiality because, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, there was a vote at 2 o'clock on New Year's Day morning because it was so difficult to reach that agreement. But I think it comes down to the fact that we now just have an unproductive Congress, failing to address the key questions. And so it's not surprising that it has been last Congress was the least productive, and this one may overtake it, since 1947. And President Truman in that Congress described it as a do-nothing Congress. They enacted 906 laws, and the last Congress enacted 283. Currently, I think maybe to date, about 46 laws have been enacted. So it just gives you a measurement to the degree by which we can, understand the level of inactivity, the lack of productivity, the lack of focusing on the critical questions that matter to this country. It isn't as if they've accomplished their legislative agenda, so they've got all this time on their hands. The fact is they failed, and as a result, we're paying the consequences that has certainly reflected in the economy. And so that really does sort of bring us to the million-dollar question, or should I say the trillions of dollars of question, about what do we do about it? And I happen to believe, and knowing how it has worked inside the Congress, that the change won't come from within, it has to come from without. And that we really have to, I think, impose penalties on those who do not work across the political aisle and to reward those who do. Because in the final analysis, if we demand and value bipartisanship and consensus building, we'll get it. But if we don't, we won't. And that's why I've formed a political action committee called Olympia's List, because I want to build, and I have been building, a national following on my website, my Facebook, and through Twitter, because I happen to believe that we have to develop an effort to communicate to Congress in real time on the issues that matter to this country. I have joined the Bipartisan Policy Center, which was co-founded by 4 former majority leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, where I'm a senior fellow, but I also co-chair the Commission on Political Reform. And we have been holding town meetings, as we did at the Reagan Library, at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, at the Ohio State University, and the final one would be at the Kennedy Library in the spring. And on that basis, we are going to construct political and electoral and congressional reforms that we will propose, and not only propose, but hopefully to launch initiatives for enactment, because we really have to be about the change. There are enough incentives, I can assure you, and as you have witnessed, for division. The forces of division are well organized and they're well financed. And so we have to be a counterweight to the extremist elements and to the forces, of division. And that means that we have to weigh into the system. And literally, it's at our fingertips. I mean, we can use the same social media and online technology as those who fan the flames of polarization. And, we can build, an online community instantaneously. It's a message multiplier. It's a way of communicating effectively. I mean, it's not as if you have to use the rotary dial telephone and dial one number after another. And that's what, those on the far right or the far left, they've been able to do because they've weighed into the system. And, Congress pays attention to who is calling in and who weighs into the system. And you cannot underestimate or minimize your voice or the impact you can have by communicating messages in real time on what's happening in Congress. For example, just on this budget conference that's occurring, that's underway, insisting that they reach an accord, and also resolving the question of this open-endedness and temporary extension of the funding of government and the debt ceiling. Get it done. Remove the uncertainty, but weigh in. I read a disturbing article that was printed in Politico, Capitol Hill newspaper, and it described about 8 pre-shutdown assumptions that didn't pan out. One of which was that lawmakers were surprised that there was no public backlash or outcry over the shutdown. So that's the point. They're not hearing from the other side. And they're hearing the louder voices who weigh in and run ads and, you know, threaten to have primaries, and the list goes on. And so the rest of America does not weigh in. And that is part of the problem now. In order to change it, we have to be the counterweight to make the difference. For example, on the universal background check, the polls, you know, reflected strong, overwhelming support by the American people. In fact, so many people ask me, well, if it was 90% support, how is it didn't pass the Congress? I said, because it was about that 10%. It is that 10%. You know, silence is not golden in this instance, I can assure you, because it can be presumed to be acquiescence, path of least resistance, whatever the case may be. And so that's why we have to be actively engaged, you know, in this process and make a difference. Remember back when they allowed the automatic cuts to trigger, there was a cutback in air traffic controllers. And there was a slowdown in flights. I'm sure you experienced it here at Newark Airport and LaGuardia and so on. I happened to be on a plane and experienced it, and we were idling on the tarmac. And so members of Congress were scheduled to go on break, as I mentioned earlier. They didn't want to be sitting on those idling planes on the tarmac with angry constituents and having the pilot come over the intercom saying this is due to congressional budget cuts. So they fixed it. In Congress's time frame, it was instantaneous because they didn't want to experience the repercussions that would result, you know, from angry constituents. That's the point. And we should be very angry about the dysfunction because it does affect America. It affects all of us and affects future generations. And we should not accept the lowest common denominator in governance. There's no reason, because it has worked differently in the past and it can work differently in the future. This is the exception. It is not the norm. We are a can-do country, and we should exemplify and demonstrate that can-do spirit. The late Senator Warren Rudman once said, politics is too important to be left to the politicians. That is so much the truth. It's true. And it's about each of us and mattering and making a difference. And so that's why I'm involved in efforts to spearhead the change, because we have to make a difference. We do not want this to become a permanent way of political life, because it is not reflective of who we are as Americans. As somebody once said, bipartisanship is not a political theory, it is a political necessity. And that is so true. Unless either side has all of the votes and wants to drive the issues and take it to the next election, that's their prerogative. But once you don't, you have to work with the other side. That's what it's all about. And that's why I want to make sure that young people understand, and I visit campuses, to make the point that you have to be willing to take the risk to work with each other instead of against each other. That you have to be willing to listen to those with whom you disagree, that you're not going to get 100% of what you want, because I've never known any sphere of life in which you can. And that at the end of the day, that you're willing to solve the problems, and that you don't have a monopoly on all of the good ideas. And that you really, truly do have to work with the other side, because in the final analysis, it's about the best interests of the country. That's the only way you can accomplish great things. That has been my experience over time. And has been, you know, when I was writing my book, and it wasn't exactly part of my plan, it certainly wasn't foremost on my agenda. But, you know, I was approached about writing a book and sharing my experiences and how it used to work. And, you know, it hasn't always been this way, as Ruth said, and it doesn't have to be this way in the future, because it is true. So many great things came from collaboration. If you think about Social Security and Medicare, or the Voting Rights Act, they were adopted and became the fabric of our nation because of the strong bipartisan majorities. But today, to enjoy those types of bipartisan majorities would almost have to be mythological in this political environment, regrettably. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case in the future if you have people who are willing to cross the political aisle, to do what's right, and to understand the essence of public service, and that is to represent the people who elected you and to solve the problems facing your constituents and your country. So, and that's ultimately what America is all about. So I'm using the book to engage people. It's sort of a blueprint on some of the things that can be accomplished to make the difference, and how we can pave the way for the future, and to make Congress the solution-driven powerhouse that it once was. If we think about the founding of our country, it was based on consensus and compromise, because our founding fathers were sharply opinionated, deeply divided. They certainly weren't wallflowers. And they argued about many things petty and consequential. But at the end of the day, they understood the gravity and the enormity of their circumstances, necessitated the courage to advance decision-making on the basis of consensus, and produce the most ingenious governing document the world has ever known, and hence the United States of America. That's the kind of greatness what is America, and reflective of America, and that's what we have to maintain and sustain by having the right leadership and the right people in the positions that can make a difference. So thank you, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So due to the size
Yes.
of our space tonight, and also because we are filming for our YouTube channel, I'd ask for you to just raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you. And please also just tell us your name and if you're involved at Rutgers and where you're from in New Jersey, so we know who we're talking with tonight. Questions? I think we have a question.
Hi, my name
Hi.
is Danielle Pritchett. I'm a PhD candidate in political science here at Rutgers. So I guess I'm from the Piscataway, New Brunswick area in New Jersey. My question for you is, well, thank you for coming and speaking. I agree with you in your point about people needing to express their opinions about policy and the things that are going on in their areas. But my question is, how do you deal with the fact that your congressperson isn't the problem? And I know it's talked a lot in research, but I come from Delaware, so I've always had congresspeople, whether they were conservative or more liberal, that were willing to work and agree with many of the points that you've given. And here in New Jersey, I'm kind of in the same predicament. So what are your suggestions when I call my congressman and he basically agrees with what I'm asking him to do?
He agrees? Okay, well, that's good, if it's right. But and that's all right. I think that the question is making sure that in the House of Representatives, for example, given the lack of competitive seats, congressional seats, I mean, because of the gerrymandering that's occurred, in the last reapportionment, and that has resulted in congressional seats that are basically homogenized politically. I mean, they're solidly Republican or Democrat, and virtually very few toss-ups. So the election ultimately is almost predetermined. And I think that's where it is important for the country overall. It's not as if you're going to change every congressional seat or every state, but I do think it is important to make sure there's a competition in these congressional seats, because that requires them to hear many voices, not just one voice, and be in an echo chamber every time they return home. As a Republican in Maine, I was representing a blue state. I heard many voices. I heard Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and so on. So, you know, you had to pay attention to the issues. But if you just reinforcing that echo chamber, then there's no interest or proclivity towards moving on the other side, because it risks having a primary. That's why everything's so narrowly tailored now, not to the broader electorate, and developing a broader, you know, legislative initiative, but rather tailored to appeal to the bases. And they're all designed in that fashion, to minority interests or single causes. And as a result, you get more political positions on the floor of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate than you do the harmonization of those views, because there's no impetus if you represent, you know, either Republicans or Democrats, and you don't reflect a blended constituency. And that's what's happening, frankly. And the very fact that you have more closed primaries that you know, do not allow independents to vote, which I think could make a difference in some of the Senate races, that there'd be more competition and more incentives. As you know, the society is sort of dividing up. I always say that I was evaluated through the prism of MSNBC and Fox News. Isn't everything divided that way? And just people want to just reaffirm what they believe or what they see, so they just tune in to those people who share their views. They move into neighborhoods now, they share their views, and they're not really countenancing any, you know, dissonant voices, because they're not interested. They're right and they're wrong. I mean, and that's what's happened. And it's all reflected, you know, in the Congress. And that's what's got to change. And there has to be a willingness to listen to differing views. And the only way you can do that is to break up some of these congressional seats. CNN had a piece not too long ago that showed some of the interesting gyrations with these districts that were drawn. One was called the Earmuff District, and some looked like prehistoric animals. And, you know, it did very interesting graphics. But it just makes the point that they, you know, certainly went out of their way. Now, in California, they had an independent redistricting commission. In fact, I met with a woman who served on that commission a few weeks ago, and we got talking about, because I think we should develop independent redistricting commissions in states and have citizens' initiatives if it can't be done through the legislature. And that's one of the issues we'll focus on. But it worked exceptionally well. In fact, Governor Brown credits a lot of the change in California to three things, and includes the Independent Redistricting Commission that was adopted in California as one of them, because it reorients the candidates towards the middle and not to the fringes. And that's what's happened now. So that's the point. In the meantime, we have to communicate with our elected officials. And we can't assume somebody else is doing it. And we got to make it happen, because they will be, you know, they will pay attention. I can assure you, if they're getting, you know, overwhelming messages, whether it's letters or phones or, you know, emails or whatever the case may be, they will pay attention. But if they don't hear, then, you know, it's like that tree that falls in the forest. If no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. The point is, you have to really speak up. And so that, I think that's what's important. But I think the independent redistricting commissions can make a difference, open primaries, so that you have more candidates that are emerging from the primaries that not less ideological, and perhaps more center-right, more center-left than far-right or far-left. And that's what's really changed in the dynamic. And, you know, I was at a forum in Harvard recently, and we were discussing this whole notion. Somebody raised the question about the personalization of media, because you can personalize your media now, you know, on your iPad and on your iPhone, or whatever the case may be, and, you know, just select those from whom you want to hear, right? And just reaffirming your views. and your thoughts. And so, unfortunately, then, there's no tolerance or patience for listening to, you know, views from the opposing side. And that's true in the media 24/7. They want people on one side of the issue or the other side of the issue, but they don't want to do that much in the middle, you know. It gets messy. It's not clear, it's not theatrical, it's not, you know, hostile, it's not passionate, you know, it's all of those things. But the interesting part about all of that is the difficulty is sorting through the issue. And yet you have to have more people in political office sorting through the issues. Those who ended up sorting through the issues were basically those in the middle, the moderates. I used to say to my staff all the time, don't you think other members of the United States Senate should be going through this process? Because if it's coming down to your vote, there's a major responsibility involved. And you have to make those decisions. You know, that's why I worked through the health care issue to the end. Because, you know, you have to give it the time, the patience, the understanding. And then you make your decision. But you have to sort through these issues. So contrary to what some people think, oh, moderates and centrists, oh, no, they're wishy-washy and so on. To the contrary, it's a tougher position when you have to consider the facts. Right? It's true. I mean, facts, you know, they don't take center stage in Congress these days. They're little clippy talking points. I used to kid some of my colleagues in Republican conferences. I said, do you think we get something a little bit more detailed than, you know, it's good for the taxpayers, bad for the taxpayer, whatever the case? And I always told myself, bring me the facts and I can solve the problem. And understand the other side and talking to them and sitting across the aisle or in a committee. But the committee process is broken down. I mean, you don't get the kind of committee work that you did in the past. That's what I was saying about the abandonment of the legislative process, because that's true. That's precisely what has happened. The exception this year, I think, in the Senate was the immigration bill. That's how the process should work. It was an open process, both in the committee and on the floor. That's the way it should work. But it hasn't been. And therein, you know, lies the difference about where we are today because of failure to exercise that kind of approach and deliberation. It takes much more work, I can assure you. You know, President Kennedy once said that conciliators and compromisers face the severest test of political courage because they have to oppose the extremist views. And it's true because you have to be the one to sorting through, you know, all of those arguments and figuring out what's worthy and what isn't.
And I know we have a lot of students in the back, Sarah. I don't know if you want to
Yes.
grab a question from the back there.
Sure.
Hi, Senator. Thank you very much for
Yes,
coming.
thank you.
My name's
Oh,
Frank
yes.
Greeneagle. I teach here at the School of Social Work, and I'm getting a degree in public policy. And one of my concerns is that the people who are in charge of making the changes won't make the changes because the status quo benefits them. So I'm thinking about the problem of Congress going into lobbying after they leave office. And even when they changed the law, so Trent Lott quit early so he could get a cushy lobbying job, but people get around that by going as consultants. And so they're still lobbyists, but they get paid other ways. And my feeling is, unless they change that law somehow to close that loophole, there won't be any effect. But we're asking the people that benefit from this to change the law, so it's really a vicious cycle. Can you address that, please?
Yeah, I know there have been issues on this question about what is, you know, advisor or consultant, whether or not it constitutes lobbying, and that's something that obviously, you know, should be explored and considered. And what exactly are they doing that, you know, ultimately could constitute or reflect influencing, you know, or advocating, you know, passage or action on legislation. That's certainly, you know, an issue. In the Senate, we had a 2-year ban. I think the House has a 1-year ban because each House has their own set of rules. But that's, you know, it's an important issue, no question. There shouldn't be a revolving door. And that's why we enacted the 2-year ban. And in many ways, it's been very restrictive, and I don't know enough about how this other works on advisors and so forth, where they can have, you know, that kind of impact that would be comparable to lobbying into whether or not that should be addressed. But that's certainly something that should be considered because it is important and it should be rectified. I mean, there's no question. And that's why we took such heavy action. In some ways, the restriction on lobbying has been very broad to the point where you're very reluctant to communicate at all with your, you know, former colleagues for 2 years other than basic niceties because you can't advocate with them in any way, even if you aren't lobbying. I mean, I just, you know, because it's so broad, you don't even entertain the notion, you know, of having conversations in that fashion.
We'll grab another question from the front here. Did you still have a question, sir?
Senator, thank you for
Yes,
being with us
thank
tonight.
you.
Bill Healy, many years ago, a staffer for one of your former House colleagues, Jim Quarter, and happy to hitch a ride tonight with one of your former staffers. My question to you is this, and I say this as a lobbyist operating in Trenton for 30 years. Will the conditions ever exist in Congress to address or take a stab at campaign finance reform and what I see is, quite frankly, the corrosive impacts of money? And I say that we just went through a major legislative cycle here where advertising carpet bombed all of us.
Well, I was part of the last campaign finance reform effort in the McCain-Feingold. In fact, my provision was the one that was struck down in the Citizens United. And it had been challenged in the Supreme Court twice. It was upheld the first time, thanks to, you know, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, but unfortunately she wasn't there the next time. And ultimately it was struck down, and then they went beyond that and unraveled 100 years of precedent in case law. And now the real challenge is how do you address it? And I've had a lot of discussions with different people interested in working on this issue, and we're going to look at it within our reform package because obviously it is a key question. How do we address, you know, the fundamental problems with the financing of campaigns where there's just simply too much money? I mean, if you look at what's, you know, the expenditures of outside organizations and third-party groups, which has increased about 75 times over the last 20 years. All of those ads that are run by outside groups, third-party interests, basically are attack ads. And that contributes to the polarization as well, because these ads demonize the other side. They become the politics of destruction. It's not enough to defeat your opponent, it's how about destroying your opponent. It's almost as if they're not secure in their own notions that they can't debate the ideas. So you go a step further, and that deters a lot of people from even entering the political arena because it's a demonization, you know, of individuals because you're spending monumental amounts of money these attack ads. So you're sitting in your state, and a group from the outside can come in and pour these millions of dollars now and just assail people and affect, you know, their reputations. And so something obviously has to be done. I mean, but 71% of those ads are attack ads. I mean, think about the millions of dollars that are spent. So no wonder, you know, we've developed this poisonous political atmosphere. So by the time you get to Congress, it's all spilled over. You see, it isn't as if you can divorce it from the campaign and you go to Washington and you leave it behind. To the contrary, you bring it all with you. And then you exact, you know, revenge, and, you know, you're going to go after the other side, and there's a vehemence and a vitriol, you know, that, you know, I haven't seen before. I mean, you had your differences in your fight, and that's what it's all about, you know, but it's not about the level and the degree of the hostility that exists today, and that the expenditures of millions of dollars. So how do you get at this issue? And that's a good question, short of a constitutional amendment. Because my provision was addressing the advocacy ads, and I thought, and working with a lot of experts, and we took a long time. I mean, we worked years in various iterations to get it right, to draw a bright line on the ads that run 60 days before an election and 30 days before a primary, which was to say that if you run an ad 60 days before a general election, for example, and you say, tell Senator Snowe she better vote X, Y, and Z, and she's up for re-election, then that constitutes an election as designed to influence the outcome of an election. Therefore, you should disclose. You have to do disclosure. And secondly, you can only take so much money in contributions. You are a political action committee because you're influencing the outcome. It's not issue advocacy. Now, if you said, tell the senator to vote X, Y, and Z, then it wouldn't be considered because you're not naming the person 60 days before the election, that person who's up for re-election. Unfortunately, he got struck down. So how you get around all of that in the constitutional requirements and challenges remains to be seen. I think we can start by, maybe targeting, tax credits and so forth to benefit small contributors. And, that's very important. I think we should get rid of leadership PACs. I think I was one of, fewer than 5 that did not have leadership PAC in the United States Senate out of 100. Now, it used to be leadership PACs were designed to, for those who were running for leadership, but, help their, colleagues and so on and so forth. Well, today, everybody, and more than half the House of Representatives have leadership PACs. That's another level of fundraising. On top of their own fundraising and every other fundraiser, it's all fundraising. What's the point of having all these people raising all this money? It's another way of getting around the system to give money to their colleagues at higher levels and higher amounts. And of course, there were some issues, I know 60 Minutes did a piece recently about how some of those leadership PAC money is used as well. So, to me, you get some money out of the system, ban those leadership PACs, frankly. But we're going to be looking at this question. It's a tough one, but you're absolutely right. It's undeniable. Yes?
Yeah, I think we just have a question from the back of the room from a student, and then we'll pop up here. We're just trying to alternate so everybody gets a chance.
I'm Paul. I'm a political junkie. I don't know if you've heard, but there's been a filibuster change today. You may not have heard it, but could you comment on your feelings about that?
Well, it does, threaten the traditions and the way in which the Senate operates. It's unfortunate it reached that point. I was asked about the circumstances last week in the Senate by a reporter because at that point there was anticipation that the third nominee would be rejected by Republicans for the court. And, I said they're doing it at their peril. I mean, frankly, it runs the risk of inviting punitive measures such as exercising what they call the nuclear option because it jettisons the 60-vote requirement, in this case, for judicial nominees with the exception of Supreme Court nominees. That's a major change for the Senate. And unfortunately, I mean, the two leaders couldn't talk to one another and work it out, which is where it should have occurred, frankly, to work out their differences, because this is a serious, I think, rupture in the traditions and the practices of the United States Senate. The Senate was never designed to be a majority rule institution, because we have that in the U.S. House of Representatives, but the same token, it's also it's designed for majority rule, but accommodating the rights of minorities. So it's a blend, it's building consensus. That's why unanimous consent, reaching agreement of all 100, just to move things along, the things that have no controversy, but those are few and far between these days. But there is no communication between the leaders to affect the change or to, avert a crisis and such a rupture. And so it remains to be seen, but I can't help but think that this just opens the door, from some very difficult moments in the Senate and down the road, and, the potential for retaliatory tactics. Because what happens is that there are long memories. Amazing how long the memories are, in the Senate. And what will happen it started all, you know, in 2005 on this whole question about jettisoning the 60 votes because there was a problem on President Bush's judicial nominees, and the minority at that time were the Democrats. They were blocking it systematically, so the majority leader, the Republican, was threatening to jettison the 60-vote rule. A group of us got together known as the Gang of 14. They always call everybody gangs, you know, I don't know, that's, you know, leave it to your imagination. But anyways, so there were a gang of 14, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and absolutely, we reached an agreement to avert crossing what I describe as the political Rubicon. And what it did was say that we would not vote to filibuster a judicial nominee unless it's on the basis of extraordinary circumstances, but we, you know, developed this accord on the basis of trust, trusting one another to make the decision in what constituted extraordinary circumstances. But ultimately, it opened the door for confirmation of President Bush's nominees. And we had this lever, and it worked because it held us to, we held ourselves to a certain standard, and we could make the difference, you know, as to whether or not we would block or support a nomination going forward. And so that we would respect one another's, you know, decision. If one decided unilaterally to say, yes, my objections constitutes extraordinary circumstances. And that's how it worked. And then, you know, at the beginning of this year, there was a threat again by the majority leader, the Democrat, to Harry Reid, to exercise the nuclear option because of the filibuster. And they reached an agreement temporarily for this Congress. And then, of course, this all happened with judicial appointments in the district court. And it's unfortunate, really, because you don't know to what degree this will reverberate in the future. It is a major change. And because it changed the rules of the Senate by virtue of a majority vote. So you could take the next step and ascribe that change to legislation. I mean, you just never know how far this can all go. And unfortunately, and when it gets to their memories, each employs the other's old tactics depending on which position they're in. You know, if the majority becomes a minority, they say, well, when they were in the minority, they did this. The minority becomes a majority, well, when they were in the majority, they did this. And ultimately, that's what could result. And it's just unfortunate it ever reached this point. And it shouldn't have. And it should require the communication between the two leaders. Senator Daschle and Senator Lott, when they were in leadership, had a designated phone line to each other so that they could talk to each other any time of day if there was any problem. That's a huge difference from today when they invariably, irregularly, if at all, have conversations, you know, I mean, from time to time. And the Senate, it's very difficult to work the Senate if you don't.
Yes, my name is Beth Heyer, and I'm involved with the League of, excuse me, with the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. And I am interested in the comments you made about how important it is for all of us to get involved, to express our opinions. And my concern is that, as my kids like to say, back in the olden days when I was in school, we all had to take courses in civics and government, and we all graduated from high school understanding how our government works. And I am concerned that that is no longer the case, and that our population does not understand how the government works. Is your efforts, and are your efforts as part of Olympia's list to address that situation?
It will be in the Bipartisan Policy Center. I mean, I know that my colleague, former Secretary of Agriculture and a former Congressman, Dan Glickman, has talked about this whole issue, and I think that would be part of our initiative when we issue our plan in the spring on civics education. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We have to. There's no question. And we have to introduce that and make sure that our young people are educated in our system and what it's all about, and our history, and making sure that they get through these courses, you know, and understanding the important chapters and events and developments and, you know, what comprises our system and what works. I mean, absolutely. No, we do. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, that's high on the list. I've heard this from so many as well, you know, from so many people across the country. And so that has to change, absolutely. And we have to put an emphasis on it as part of the participation, you know, and possibly, you know, maybe in turnouts too. I mean, that's the other question, voter turnout. You know, do you think there should be weekend elections? Yeah. I mean, you know, that's another thing, having elections on weekends. I mean, getting voter turnout in some fashion, because I do think that that is critically important. I worry to the degree that there's a disconnect between the governed and those who are governed because of this whole detachment, what's happening in Washington, and not representing the people and not being in touch, and the disconnect that exists. And I've talked about this for the last few years. It does really concern me. And the more people are, you know, disaffected, you know, from their government for, you know, a lot of legitimate reasons right now, from Congress because they're not representing the issues and doing the things they need to do, that gap grows ever wider. And then fewer people participate, and then it becomes a, you know, a vicious circle. So, yeah, we have to change that. And I hope the voter turnout is obviously another example of what we have to do to encourage more turnout. If you think about it, that could also change the dynamic too, and that hasn't. Well, any more question from the back of the room? I know it's late for all of you. It's quarter, well. Yes.
That gentleman, the last question.
Great. My name is Daniel Manzor. I'm a Eagleton undergraduate associate, and I'm from Piscataway, New Jersey. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have someone with your knowledge and experience for students like myself. Really quickly, I'll ask one question because I know that we're running quickly. Though you champion bipartisanship across the aisle in Congress, which I do think is the right solution, do you believe bipartisanship needs to first start at the micro level, at local communities, between schools, between districts, between state lines? Because I'm pretty sure this row here may have a complete ideological difference than that row over there. And do you think the conversation first needs to start in institutions like this before we can have a successful change in Congress?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think it's happening at the local level. You know, and it sort of started at the national level and sort of filtered down, you know, in many ways. And of course, the communications have changed, I mean, as well. That's, I think, accelerated and enhanced, I think, the polarization and division of views and how people view the world and the information that you get. And so it helps, obviously. I mean, I think it's critical. And I've, you know, in my travels across the country, I've talked to a number of people who work, you know, in local politics and local government, and said that, you know, they're really trying to work together because they know they have to, and build, you know, consensus on questions. And the closer your government is, the tougher it becomes to be polarized. And you're dealing with issues of practicality. It's like what Governor Christie said, which I thought was a very poignant statement when he made the point, you know, when you have, I don't know if we get all the statistics right, but something like 385,000 people lost their homes and 7 million people without power. There were only 51 gas stations in the entire state. You know, you're not thinking about politics. You're thinking about, okay, what are we going to do to solve this? You know, these are real issues. And that's what it's all about. I think that at the local and the state level, they understand the practicality of solutions. But in Congress, they've somehow gotten divorced from the realities at home. I see a mismatch there. That's why I always conducted Main Street tours, because I thought they were invaluable, because I had the chance to meet people informally on an ad hoc basis, and they could approach me and say whatever they wanted to me. And I could understand what was happening in the community, could get the pulse of the community, what was right, what was wrong. And that's when I started to sense that this economic recovery was going awry a few years ago, that I didn't think it was as strong and as fundamental as it should have been. And I communicated that to the president. I talked to him personally. I said he should take some Main Street tours because it would be very helpful for a president to have an unfiltered view of what's going on in the world on Main Streets. You know, where people congregate, where they work, you know, where they go to church, where they, you know, meet with others and do all the things that becomes the lifeblood of a community. And I always got a sense. I never used to have to take polls. I did, but I could tell when I was up and I could tell when I was down. I mean, it didn't take many street tours to figure that out, frankly. I almost called it because I had a narrow election in 1990, and my husband didn't believe me. But I said, you know, I don't know. I don't like the looks of this one. I can feel it. And I just had taken several Main Street tours. It was, you know, it was a tough time with the recession and everything. But nevertheless, you get an understanding, and that just doesn't exist today. There's no correlation between what's happening in Washington and what's happening at home. And you see that disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street. You know, it's good that Wall Street's doing well, there's the market going up, but that is not mirroring Main Street. And that's not saying in all places and in all parts of the country, but in many parts that's, you know, reflected in the statistics that I was referring to earlier. Those are very, you know, those are serious. You know, there are so many people long-term unemployed. There are 90 million non-working men and women. I mean, according to the Wall Street Journal, they did this editorial recently talking about that, and that's profound. And we need to change that and create opportunities, and it now is dependent on Congress to create the right kind of economic climate and environment, which means dealing with the taxes and dealing with the debt and dealing with entitlement, so there's certainty in how we move forward as a nation, so that it gives certainty to those who are willing to take the risks and to create the jobs, invest the capital. So it begins everywhere, but I think that closer to home, people understand it. And it certainly helps. And maybe that message will percolate up as well. But you need to demand it from your elected officials. I would not accept anything less. We do not have to accept, you know, the lowest common denominator, you know, when it comes to governance and when it comes to results. We really don't, and we shouldn't. Thank you. Thank you.